Welcome to another episode of Painters Unscripted. I'm Peter Darley.
And I'm Elizabeth Darley.
And this is episode 2. And it's the 21st of April 2020. Hello, and welcome to Painters Unscripted, the new weekly podcast about painters and their work. And I'm delighted to continue my talk with the painter Elizabeth Dahle at her studio in Yorkshire. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hello, Peter. Thanks for inviting me back.
Looking at your new project, I see a consistency in style in watercolour. Would you tell us something about this?
It all comes from the why and the what of my new artwork. Why am I making art, and what would be appropriate as far as I'm concerned? Why? To tell a story of my experiences in looking at ruined monasteries. What? Well, what is important to me, such as my birthplace, Yorkshire, and monasteries in Yorkshire. And then, being English or British, what's quintessentially British or English in art? Watercolour. The English watercolour school of the 18th century. And then taking that to Yorkshire, we have watercolours of Yorkshire monasteries, say Fountains Abbey and Revo. And that takes me to the great artists Turner and Girton.
So in episode 1 you said you were going to tell us why artists such as Girton and Turner painted Fountains Abbey.
Yes, they painted Fountains Abbey as part of a tour of the north. Girton went first. Girton was born in 1775 in London, and then after him Turner did his tour of the north. He was born in 1775 in London as well. They were both topographical artists, and they learnt together, they trained together.
But you said earlier that they weren't Christian, so why would they want to paint such as Fountains Abbey?
Because they were living in the period called the Romantic period, or the period of Romanticism. So the ruins of Fountains Abbey became valuable in the hearts and minds of artistically inclined people in the 1700s, which went hand in hand with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. So at that time we had Beethoven, Wordsworth, Turner living at the same time, all part of the Romantic era, and they were working to commission, particularly Turner, to make a living. So to make a living, one of his pictures was of Fountains Abbey, because at that time something called the Grand Tour was the thing to do if you were the son of a gentleman. So you would go on a grand tour around Europe, but it was impossible to do it round about the late 1700s because Europe was constantly at war. So the British would tour the UK instead, stay on these shores. So Girton went to the north and Turner went to the north, and they did what is called topographical pictures, which were measured precise watercolours or drawings, finished watercolours of well-known places. So Fountains Abbey was a well-known place by the late 1700s, and it was already a Georgian water garden as well. But the ruins themselves, or any monastery ruins, weren't seen as anything of any value in the eye of an artist. They were just seen as ruins, such as a ruined barn. We would see a ruined barn now, and we would think, oh, it looks quite pretty because it's made of natural stone. But it was a new thing in those days, in the late 1700s in England, to look at a ruined abbey and actually see beauty in it for the first time. But the beauty they saw in it wasn't anything to do with Christianity. It was the beauty of nature, because it was always set, the monasteries were always set, the Cistercian monasteries, set in the countryside. So Fountains Abbey was 3 miles, or is 3 miles from Ripon, and it's in the countryside. It's near the River Skell, which is why it's there, to use the power of the water for the mill. And to be able to live, they needed the river in the 1100s. So when it's a ruin from the time of Henry VIII onwards, say through the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, it's just a ruin, it's just a pile of old stones. And then along comes the Romantic period, and things are looked at with new, fresh eyes. Nature is looked at as something to contemplate, something to relate to in itself, rather than seen as God's creation. So new ways of thinking were deliberately coming about. Intelligent people wanted to try out non-Christian ways of thinking as a sort of experiment, really, which also led to the French Revolution. So it's all interconnected in the 1700s. And we have Beethoven and Wordsworth and Turner all connected through a new love of nature, which in a way echoes the classical periods, particularly of the ancient Greeks, but in a different way, because the ancient Greeks and the Romans didn't necessarily have a particular love of nature, as if nature is a woman who you fall in love with. But the Romantic period of Wordsworth, Beethoven, Turner was like falling in love with a person, nature, and nature was seen as a goddess. So that's how all this work came about.
But surely Turner, I've heard he was interested in money. He wouldn't do it just for the love of it. Wouldn't someone commission him?
Yes, Turner was very interested in money. I mean, obviously, I didn't know Turner. I wasn't alive then, but I have read, and it looks to me that he put money at the top of his list, even above his art, actually. I think if he hadn't made any money from his art, I don't think he would have bothered doing art. He wouldn't have been like Van Gogh and put his art before everything else. I think Turner, the top of his list was money. So yes, he had to make a living, and he started making a living when he was 12, and he sold drawings of the Thames to his father's customers, because his father was a barber surgeon and he had been a wig maker, but he'd gone into the trade of being a barber. And quite a few of the customers coming into the shop in Covent Garden when Turner was a child were Royal Academicians. What a connection! And the father Mr. Turner seemed to have quite a good business sense, and I think he just really encouraged his son to do what he can to bring in some money. Fair enough, of course. So they had to eat, they had to pay rent, they had to make a living, and they were really surviving. So they used their intelligence, and the father encouraged the son. He said, yes, you're good at drawing, I can tell. You've got more than an average talent there. So he would say, look at what my son can do, and he'd put them on the walls of his barber shop. And these were Royal Academicians, and they would look at this gallery, and a boy of 10, 11, 12 was able to show his work to Royal Academicians, and he would sell them to him, and also he would sell works on a stall in Soho for the daughters of the gentry to finish working on in their own private situation. And he would sell lessons. He'd sell art lessons. By the time he was about 19 years old, he was selling art lessons for about £33 an hour.
So back to Fountains Abbey, was he in fact commissioned to do these paintings?
Yes, I mean £33 an hour in 2020. Yes, so he was commissioned, and the sooner he could get a commission, the better, really.
Do you know who commissioned him?
Yes, they were people. There were men who were the sons of the aristocrats, and he must have been so bright, Turner, to get these commissions from them, and he knew how to turn on the charm. But he was good. He was just mind-blowingly brilliant, but so was Girton. And I don't know how Girton got the work, but Turner could apparently turn on the charm, so I've read. And therefore these chaps would think, oh, not a bad chap at all, and I really admire his skills. So they would say, right, I have a house, it's called Starbridge in Wiltshire, and I'd like a series of pictures of my house from different viewpoints in the landscape.
But back up to Yorkshire, who commissioned Fountains Abbey?
He would go on tour and someone would say, I want you to do pictures of the north. So it would be an aristocrat in the north.
But we haven't got a name.
Yes, there'd be, some of them were through marriage, they were the family of Guy Fawkes at Farnley Hall. And another one would be the Earl of Harwood House near Leeds. So these people became Turner's friends, because Turner must have known he would have to make friends with them.
Well, I bet he charged Guy Fawkes a bomb.
It was one of Guy Fawkes' relatives through marriage. But give or take a couple of 100 years, 150 years or so. But he sold pictures for about 250 guineas in those days.
That was a lot of money then.
In about 1800, yes.
So, your paintings, has anyone commissioned you?
No, not yet. I mean, not with the one I'm doing at the moment. No, not with this project. I suppose I'm commissioning, yes, I'm commissioning myself, really.
Okay, but you've had commissions in the past, haven't you?
Yes, it's wonderful getting a commission. It's the most gorgeous feeling. There was a lovely time when I was on Huddersfield railway station wearing my cloak, because I used to do all the time, and I was in the cafe, and the woman working in the cafe, I was just paying for my coffee and a sandwich, and she said to me, I bet you're artistic, aren't you? And I said, yes. And she said, what do you do? And I said, I'm a painter. And this is ever so strange. I mean, she said, I want you to do a portrait of my daughter. And she just asked me to do it there and then. And I did. And I worked from life, and she came to my cottage in Holmfirth. I think I've got a photograph of the finished one, and I was paid. She paid me, and the daughter went to live in Ireland, Southern Ireland, and I don't know if I think the mother kept the painting for herself rather than the daughter take it off to Ireland. So I think that painting will still be in England. Okay,
so you've talked about these rich patrons in the north who would commission Turner and possibly Girton. So where did they get all the money from?
Well, quite a few of them were the heir of the family estate. So they were the firstborn son, so they inherited the house. And they built on what they got. So they, for instance, Harwood House was freshly built, again with new money. As the family grew in the 1700s, they could afford to build a new version of their house on the land, and it must have been an amazing feeling to do that. In the 1600s this was happening when the abbeys were demolished. The stone would be taken to build a mansion, a privately owned mansion. For instance, Fountains Hall is built of the stone that was taken from Fountains Abbey, which to me is a little bit painful to look at. Fountains Hall, now I know that, it's not very nice. With being a Catholic, that I find that painful, so I don't think I'd want to look at Fountains Hall anymore, but that's just my own personal, that's where my heart lies. So the money would come from farming the land around the hall that they owned, and also from the slave trade, because the slave trade started in Europe in the 1400s, and the British finished their own trading they banned it, the abolition of the slave trade, 1807, but that took 20 years to get through Parliament, and it was the Christians who did that. But in the late 1800s, the slave trade was bringing in loads of money for people who owned big houses, and they could afford to have a big house because of the slave trade. So if there'd never been a slave trade in the whole world, a lot of things would never have happened. There wouldn't have been just about everything that you would consider to be a great thing to go and see. There wouldn't have been the pyramids, there wouldn't have been Rome, there wouldn't have been Greece, there wouldn't have been... You couldn't go and see these ruins now because no one would have been able to afford to build them without a slave trade. So you wouldn't be able to have a lot of things. You can research very easily on the internet and find out if something really is built on the slave trade or not built on the slave trade, and the National Trust has put in its own research into all of this because it's a very important subject. And also people who continue to live in these houses now, people who have inherited them, are apologetic about it, and what do you do? I mean, you could shut up shop and start all over again from scratch because your great-great-grandfather made money out of the slave trade, or you could live now and do the best with the resources that you have, such as Harwood House, and be positive rather than negative. So it's better to be like that. But when Turner and Girton were there, I don't think they'd be that interested in the slave trade themselves, but the connection was there. They were working for people who made a profit from the slave trade.
Okay, so there are probably thousands of pictures of Fountains Abbey, and Turner has done all this, so why are you doing it? Is it from a different perspective, a different angle?
Yes. I can't see any point in doing art unless you've got something new to say. And I do have something different to say. It isn't new, what I'm saying, but then again, I suppose it is. But Turner did pictures of Fountains Abbey with the sunset, pieces of just genius work. So one of his very famous ones is the transept and dormitory at the time of the sunset. So it's facing west. Now, the sunset is a symbol of death. It's a symbol of the fact that we will all die. The sun goes down. And I think Turner particularly liked the colours and the qualities of the light in the sunset more than he liked the sunrise. I'm not entirely sure about that. But as a Catholic, I want the sunrise, not the sunset. So the sunrise is about the sun rising in the east, and the sun rising in the east at Fountains Abbey is the Chapel of the Nine Altars.
Thank you, Elizabeth Darley. I'm Peter Darley, and you've been listening to episode 2 of Painters Unscripted, and it's the 21st of April 2020.